Hello, welcome to my presentation of Contemporary Intellectual Assessment, the fourth edition, presented by yours truly, Trey Stogsdill, Master of Education. Wow, whatever. No, I don't have a PhD, but I do have a brain and I can read. So I am a practicing educational diagnostician. I work in a very large public school district just northwest of Houston, Texas. Um, and what I kind of do on my spare time, is I like to get books that pertain to my field and read them. I try to read at least one a year, um, sometimes two, but at least one. And what I do to actually learn the stuff, I got to do something with it. So I make a presentation about it, usually a PowerPoint or something, and it helps me to learn the material, and then I go and I try to put it into practice with some of the assessments that I do during the school year. And so that's what I did with this book, Contemporary Intellectual Assessment. I got this last year and I thought, wow, holy cow. I mean, this book is really mind blowing. And usually what I do is I just make a PowerPoint presentation for me, just for me. Sometimes I'll share it with other people in my district, but you know, s- usually we're just kind of sitting in front of my director of diagnosticians and listening to them. They don't really want to listen to me. Um, but this is the first presentation that I've made for YouTube, so I hope you like it. There's going to be a lot of great things in here, so keep watching. Don't give up on me. But before I actually begin the presentation, I want to mention a few things. The first thing is about the audience of this presentation. So this presentation is mainly for educational diagnosticians, LSSPs, and maybe some psychologists or so. If you don't know what those people do or what an LSSP is or what a diagnostician is, probably this video is probably not for you. Um, if you're a parent or an advocate or just kind of flipping through YouTube, uh, this is not going to be for you because there's going to be a lot of jargon and things in here that you're not going to understand. And so I just wanted to put that out there at the very front of the presentation so you don't waste your time. Um, the second thing I want to mention is kind of tease you a little bit about some of the topics we're going to be talking about. So the first one is the divorce of GLR. Yes, I said the divorce of GLR. And of course, GLR meaning long-term storage and retrieval. There is a divorce of those two, which I'll explain in more detail. Um, I'm also going to talk about other changes to other broad and narrow abilities that have come about recently. Then I'm going to be talking about recommendations for testing. Some of those may be new to you. I'll be talking about some general information about LD, SLD, and also there's a good chapter in here about intellectual disabilities, which you'll find interesting. And then I'm also going to be talking about some new ways of thinking about testing second language learners. Okay, that's a growing topic. I work in a district where, the second language learners are, the population is growing. And especially in my school, and I would say about half of my FIEs that I write now involve a child that has been exposed to a second language. So it's a big part of my life. And so I deal with the CLIM in the XBASS program a lot, and so there's some new thinking that's come out with that. So those are just some of the topics. There'll be a couple other things thrown in there, but those are the main topics to kind of tease you with. And so the next thing is the book is actually 1,100 pages long. Okay, it is really a thick book. Uh, I'm going to be honest with you, I did not read the whole book. I don't think I could. I don't have that much of an attention span. But I did pick out the things that really kind of pertain to what we would do in public schools. But just know that what you're going to see today is absolutely not the full extent of this book. There's a lot more information in there. I do encourage you to buy it. And then lastly, at the end, I'm going to give you my email, my name and email again. You know, I do work and I have a family and all that, but if you want to shoot me an email, a professional email, say, yeah, I loved it, or hey, why don't you do a presentation on da 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 da, or whatever, um, I'd be happy to do that. So just kind of give me some feedback. So here we go, Contemporary Intellectual Assessment, fourth edition. This is the book right here. It's a beautiful book. It's like I said, it's about 1100 pages, so it's a very thick book, very expensive book. It is kind of pricey, so you might want to ask for it, as a, I don't know, Christmas gift or birthday gift or whatever. Um, but it was edited by obviously the very famous Don Flanagan and also very famous Aaron McDonough. It was published in 2018. Yes, 2018. So it is very recent. It just came out, I believe, about maybe September-ish of last year, I think, somewhere around there. And I got it about, I think about November, December of 2018. So I did try some of these things in the 2018-19 school year. And so, we'll just go over those. All right, so the book has 6 parts to it. As you can see, all the parts here. Um, The first one is the origins of intellectual assessment. That's the history of it. I am not going to go into that. I do love history, and I did make a bigger PowerPoint than what I'm showing you here in the video, just for time's sake. That was very interesting, but I just had to make a decision to leave that out. Contemporary theoretical perspectives, all of these things. The batteries associated with achievement tests, um, and then we have understanding individual differences, linking assessment data intervention, that's a big one, and then just some contemporary and emerging issues in the field there at the end. So like I said, I'm skipping part 1, so that's why this starts with part 2, and I put Kramer here because it's going to blow your mind. Um, These are contemporary theoretical perspectives. So this is the new ways of thinking about intellectual assessment. So what's new with CHC, right? So I start with chapter 3. Chapter 3 is one of the larger chapters in the book and one of the more interesting ones and more practical ones. So I call it very important, mind-blowing, conversation starter, way of the future. So, and when I go through this, you're really going to see what I mean. This chapter was written by Schneider and McGrew, so 2 big names in CHC, uh, researching uh, new areas of cognitive abilities. The first one is, so CHC theory is now officially a globetrotter. Yay! It globetrotter with a large bank of frequent flyer miles. So it is now all over the world. It's catching on in other areas. Was also talking about executive functions are becoming more and more integrated into CHC. So things like GF, GS, GWM, GV, GS, um, those are becoming more and more correlated with executive functions. So that's kind of a new area. A lot of people are a buzzword in our field about how do you assess executive functioning. Well, guess what? You already do. Okay, you already do that in those areas. And it's just, kind of an interesting question about what does this mean for testing kids with ADHD, which is obviously an executive functioning problem. Um, there's a lot of issues that go along with that. Like one, if you give a processing speed test, is that low score is it really due to low processing speed, or was it more due to just lack of attention and focus? So anyway, so lots of issues there. So that's some new stuff coming out. But this is the biggie. Wow, the biggie. All right, the divorce of GLR. I kind of teased you with that at the beginning. And when I say divorce, that means that they are taking GL and GR, and they are literally splitting it. Okay, so there is now GL and there is now GR. There are two separate broad abilities, not narrow abilities, broad abilities, two separate. So now instead of testing 7, in my district, we usually, when we do an LD assessment, we test 7 areas. Now there's 8. Okay. Um, So Schneider and McGrew now say that GLR should never have been put together in the first place. And there is a part in this chapter that um, talks about why that never should have been. But I'm not going to go into it. You can read it. In the 2012 version, which is the 3rd edition of this book, they proposed the separation, but it just never really took. For whatever reason, it never really became official. They weren't sure. But now they are officially calling it a divorce. Okay, so they've signed the divorce papers and they are living in 2 separate households. So in 2012, what they wrote was there is a major division with GLR that was always implied in CHC theory. It was always there, but now we're making it more explicit. Some GLR tests require efficient learning of new information, whereas others require fluent recall of information already in long-term storage. And I always had a feeling about long-term storage and retrieval because, on the one hand you're storing and on the other hand you're retrieving, and to me that always seemed, like 2 different areas, right? Um, but now they actually are. I was right. um, so GLR has separated into 2 households. So what you've got is the GL, which is now called learning efficiency, and GR, which is retrieval fluency. So let's discuss. So GL versus GR, how will this affect your evaluations is like one of the main questions. Like, oh my God, how do I put this in XBASS? And what do what test do I give and all that? So I'm going to go over this real quick. So learning efficiency, you have to know what it is first before you can really decide how to go about testing it. So learning efficiency determines how much effort is needed to store new information and put it in your long-term memory. Retrieval fluency is the speed at which you can put it into your working memory and recall for further cognitive processing and use. So one is encoding and the other is retrieval. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Another thing, this is nothing new. GFGC has always been around. It's been around since the 40s, but there's a kind of a new way of thinking. I don't know. I kind of like this. I've never seen this before. Cattell, which you know his name, said the relationship between GC and GF can be likened to the formation of a coral reef. Yay, coral reef. There's Nemo. Um, Actually, I think that's Nemo. That's his dad. Um, anyway, so the formation of a coral reef. So if you don't know how a coral reef works, there's 2 layers to coral reef. So here you have the lower bottom part and then a very thin layer on the top. And the thin layer is, the live part where all things are. And then the lower part is the dead part. That's the dead coral, and it's all crystallized and into rock down there below. And so here he said, fluid intelligence is like the outermost layer of the coral colony. Fluid reasoning creates new knowledge, and via memory, knowledge accumulates. Today's fluid insights become tomorrow's crystallized knowledge. So basically what he's saying is knowledge is coming in here, right? And it has to get past your fluid reasoning, has to be alive, before it then crystallizes later on into your crystallized intelligence. So this is why learning is easier when it can be linked to prior knowledge, right? If prior knowledge, in other words, GC, the bottom of the coral, isn't there, then the incoming information processed by GF cannot become crystallized. So if this part is not there, then the incoming information is just going to bounce off and float off into the ocean, and it's not really going to stick. You've got to have previously learned information, right? And it's going to link on and crystallize into GC. So I thought that was a really cool way of looking at that, and it really shows the importance of those two areas, and which is why whenever you do an assessment, um, and you're trying to get an overall average ability, GF and GC really, like if you have a deficit in one or both of those areas, um, usually you don't get the overall average ability just because they're so important. So the rest of chapter 3, yeah, the magic continues. So the rest of chapter 3 goes through all the broad processes and their narrow abilities. So first it defines them, and then it gives recommendations for all of them, and then it discusses some unresolved issues in that area. So it does that for each of the areas. We, however, are only going to talk about the relevant processes for our school evaluations. I'm not going to go into all the other ones. And then much of this information you already know. I mean, you already know about, GS, GF, GA, all those areas. But, of course, we're going to be talking about GL, GR. Some of the recommendations are new, and some of the narrowabilities are a little different than what you might be thinking. So let's start with fluid reasoning, the king of processes. So these are just different ways of thinking of GF. So GF is now kind of defined, or I'm sorry, is considered the hallmark of intelligence. I like that. As it is essential to learning in school, performance on the job, and life generally. That's how important fluid reasoning is. That's why I call it the king. Now this is the definition of it. The use of deliberate and controlled procedures, often requiring focused attention, to solve novel on-the-spot problems that cannot be solved by using previously learned habits, schemas, and scripts. You already know that when you've probably written it 1,000 times when you write definitions, or maybe you have a shell of it. Another way of thinking it is based on Spearman. So fluid reasoning is the process by which we extract new knowledge from information we already have. So new knowledge is the GF, and the knowledge we already have is the GC. It used to almost be thought of as actual G. So in the very beginning, many, many years ago, they actually thought fluid reasoning was kind of the general intelligence. But of course, now with the new research, they don't think that anymore. The book also discussed how GF and working memory are highly correlated. Talk about that in a second. So one of the narrow abilities is induction, which you know. It's called a rule reference. And basically, people with this can perceive patterns and things that otherwise might be seem unpredictable. So basically, induction is you are able to look at something and figure out the rule that governs that thing, right? Okay. Then there's general sequential reasoning, which is the rule application. So induction is figuring out the rule, and general sequential reasoning is applying that rule. So this is deductive reasoning. So they gave a pretty cool example in the book. So if you know there are no polar bears in Antarctica, and you see a picture of an iceberg with a polar bear on it, you can deduce that the iceberg is not in Antarctica. I thought was pretty cool. Then there's quantitative reasoning, which is obviously math. Okay. But the recommendations are to always test induction. Induction is the most important narrow, which maybe you already knew. General sequential reasoning is the second most important to test. Quantitative reasoning is not always necessary unless the major area of concern is math. So if the major area is reading, you probably don't need to do quantitative reasoning. What does that look like? So what I do is I'm kind of put it into some practical real world things for you. So here's some recommendations. Now I use the 4 main cognitive batteries that most people use. I know there are a lot more out there, the Stanford Binet and all that. But These are the ones that are the newest and probably the most used. So the WISC has matrix reasoning, which is induction, and figure weights, which is general sequential reasoning. So actually the WISC meets the recommendations of the book, which is why I have the happy face there. Then the WJ-COG has number series, which is a quantitative reasoning uh, test, and concept formation, which is an induction. So actually, the WJ, I don't know, this might be a shocker, does not meet the recommendations to get a composite score, right? Now, I know there's analysis, synthesis, and other, there's going to be other tests that you can use to get the different narrows, but just looking at the core battery of getting a composite, it doesn't meet the recommendations. The DOS has matrices, which is induction, and sequential and quantitative reasoning, which is general sequential reasoning. So yay, it does meet the recommendations. KBC, normative update, has pattern reasoning, which is induction, and story completion, which is general sequential reasoning. So yay! So really, the one that stinks is the WJ4. All the other ones are pretty good. That might have surprised you. Then there's working memory, and I always thought, when I first started as a diag, that's what we called it, short-term memory. And then, started WM and all this stuff, and I got confused. So in the book, it actually says that short-term memory was renamed to short-term working memory when the WJ4 came out. And then it was renamed again, I don't know why, to working memory capacity, but basically it's all working memory, okay? It's all the same thing. So I'm just going to call it working memory. So working memory is the ability to maintain and manipulate information in active attention. Short, sweet, and simple. It is thought to be an important precursor to all forms of academic achievement. All forms of academic achievement. Okay. Fluid reasoning seems to depend on it heavily. The reason why I have this picture over here is because it says that working memory kind of has its fingers in all areas of academic achievement, okay, which is why it has there. So the narrow abilities for working memory are, what we usually had was, we've usually tested, working memory, I got to remember to write them backwards, and then memory span, right, is what you're used to. But here we have auditory short-term storage, visual spatial storage, and attentional control, okay. So working memory is basically short-term storage plus attentional control. So I know that's as clear as mud, so let's just do the recommendations. So the recommendations are two types of auditory storage tests. So one that minimizes the use of a strategy, okay, like digit span. The other one, it has ecological validity, so things like recall of words or sentences, or it has some type of real word, like actual words, not just digits. So let's think about this. What are some, thinking about our four tests again. The WISC-5 has digit span, which is working memory, and picture span, which is memory span. So, not good. The WJ4 has numbers reversed, which is working memory, and those are digits. Okay, and it also has verbal attention, which is working memory, and this has more real world stuff because it's got, monkey, dog, it's got the animal names in it mixed in. So that's kind of better. That's why I gave it a smiley face, right? The DOS2 has recall of digits backward, which is memory working, that's digits, and then recall of sequential order, which is working memory again. This is real world stuff because it gives in the book, if you've never given the DOS, it's got a picture of a guy there, and you tell the child eyes, shoulders, chin, whatever, and the child has to repeat back what you said, but in descending body part order from the highest to the lowest. So it's real world ecological validity because it's using things that aren't digits. It's using actual real words. So that, I give that a smiley face. And the KBC number recall is a memory span test, and word order is a memory span test. So Not even close on the KBC. All right, so let's get to learning efficiency. This is new, right? The divorce of GLR, it's a new broad process. So what is it? It's the ability to learn, store, consolidate new information over periods of time measured in minutes, hours, days, and years. Kind of sounds like the old GLR definition, right? Um, and the reason why is because we were always kind of testing on our batteries GL. We never really were testing GR on some of these tests, um, which, is kind of an issue. The narrow abilities include associative memory, which you already know. You already know that, yay. Meaningful memory and free recall memory. You probably already know those. There's nothing new about them. So current tests were published prior to the divorce. So that's why we're in limbo with this right now because the WJ, all of those things were published or the norms were done. It was created before this new book came out, and so that's why we're going to have to kind of play catch up. So let's think about this. So recommendations for GL. So the WISC has immediate symbol translation, which is an associative memory test. That's the only thing it has. Does not have a meaningful memory test, so I gave it a sad face. The WJ4 is actually the best. It's the story recall, which has meaningful memory, and visual auditory learning, which is associative memory. So it has two narrow abilities under GL, and I don't know why I did that. It should be a happy face. Yay. I'll give it a happy face. The DOS2 just has recall of objects, okay? And that's really not even associative memory or meaningful memory. It's just recall, free recall. So that's a sad face. The KBC gets a sad face because it only tests associative memory, so Atlantis and Rebus. So really the best option for GL right now is the WJ cog. Okay. Then we have the other half of the divorce is GR, okay, retrieval fluency. That is the rate and fluency at which individuals can produce and selectively and strategically retrieve verbal and nonverbal information or ideas stored in long-term memory. So it's the retrieval process, not the storage process. Narrow abilities include ideational fluency, which you already know, and the other important one is naming facility. All these other ones you don't know, and I don't even know what they are, so I don't care. There is a speed of lexical access, which you've probably heard of before, but that's really considered an intermediate level ability, so it's not a broad ability, it's not a narrow, it's kind of in between, so it's not a star, it's not a planet, it's more like a moon or whatever. Um, so that encompasses naming facility and word fluency, okay? But anyway, we'll talk about that in a second. So the recommendations are to test ideational fluency and naming facility, which with all this dyslexia stuff, has become really important. Naming facility, which is also called rapid automatic naming, which is in the dyslexia handbook for Texas. So testing those two. So let's see what tells you that. So the WISC has naming speed literacy, which is naming facility, and naming speed quantity, which is again naming facility. So it gets a sad face because it doesn't have ideational fluency on it. The WJ cog doesn't have any of it, but the the WJ oral language has rapid picture naming, yay, naming facility, and retrieval fluency, which is ideational fluency. So it gets a smiley face, yay. The DOS has rapid naming only, so that's a sad face, and the KBC has none of that. So really your best option, if you want to get a composite of GR, is to give the WJ oral language tests. However, when you pick a test, you don't just pick a test just because you're trying to get a composite. You pick a test because it's appropriate for the situation and the child, right? So please, 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 rapid picture naming is just a bunch of pictures. But if you're doing naming facility for dyslexia and it's an older child, you don't want to do pictures, you want to do letters. So that might not be the test. You might just have to kind of put together other options, maybe like the naming speed literacy and the retrieval fluency, and put that in XBASS and get a composite. So talk amongst yourselves here from Saturday Night Live. All right, how does this all work? So I actually tried this. I've actually done this. And I've tried it on a couple of kids this past year just to see how it would work. And so I'll give you an example. I'm gonna in just a minute. But so what I did was I administered that WJCOG for GLR cluster of visual auditory learning and story recall, which we all do, right? I mean, it's common. So that wasn't anything. That was good. There wasn't anything that was like more testing, right? Then I administered the oral language rapid picture naming and retrieval fluency, which I just told you. So that gave me a composite. So here was my GL and my GR. I put these into XBASS in the gold boxes. So I don't know how familiar you are with XBASS, but when you go to the XBA analyzer, and I'll show you here in a minute, you have to scroll down farther on the page and you come to these gold boxes. And in the gold boxes has retrieval fluency, learning efficiency, orthographic processing, speed of lexical access, all of these other areas. And you can actually put test scores in there and get a composite for those. I don't know if you knew that. However, you still are under the current XBASS procedure, so you still need a GLR composite to get your FCC, okay? So, but you can choose GL or GR as a separate strength or weakness, just like orthographic processing or others. So you have to get a GLR score, and I'll show you this in just a minute how I did it. So you have to get a GLR score because that determines whether you have an overall average ability, okay? So here we go. So here's an example. So this is based on a student that I did this year. So I gave story recall, visual auditory learning from the WJCOG. He got an 87 and a 95. It gave me a composite of an 89. They were cohesive. So an 89, not lighting the world on fire, but certainly not low, 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 right? And then I gave naming speed literacy from the WISC and the WJ oral language retrieval fluency. So I didn't give only the oral language composite. I actually kind of cross-batteried on that. And I got a 79 and a 75, wow, and a 73 composite. So that's really low, right? I mean, that's a deficit. There's no question about that. So this child can encode, but he cannot retrieve information. So then I took those four scores and I put them here. So here's your story recall, visual auditory learning, right here, and the retrieval fluency and naming speed literacy right here. And it gave me an 80, and they were all cohesive. Yay! I was excited. I didn't have to do any further testing. That would be the ideal situation. And here you go. You can call GLR a deficit if you so choose. And so that gave me a facilitating composite of 95. It gave me an overall average ability. I called GLR a deficit in this case. The child also had deficits in these areas and strengths in these areas. So when I did the triangle here, I got a yes, and a yes. Okay, so qualifying for LD. Now look what I chose as the cognitive weakness. I did not choose GLR as the weakness. I chose retrieval fluency. In the XBASS, instead of GL, it calls it RF. It's the same thing. So learning efficiency. No, mess it up. This is GR, retrieval fluency. So I picked retrieval fluency as the deficit. Remember, we got a 73. That corresponded to basic reading, which was a 75. So I got a yes, yes, yes. So even though I didn't pick one of the broad areas as a weakness, I picked one of those new broad areas. I still got a yes, yes, yes. So I still qualified. Here's the opposite example. So here you have a guy with learning efficiency. Okay, the XBASS calls it LE. He got, wow, high scores. That is definitely not a deficit, right? And then I just put in the same scores here. So a deficit, again, in RF, learning efficiency, also known as retrieval fluency, also known as GR. Okay, so I put him in up at the top, and I freaked out at this point, needless to say, because one was a 109 and one was a 73. So it's like, what do I call GLR? You know, and this is where you have to kind of use your professional judgment, multiple sources of data. Remember, the XBASS should not make the decision for you. You make the decision about SLD. Okay, you make it. This is a dumb calculator. The XBASS is a calculator, a dumb old calculator. Whatever you put in, it just spits the stuff right back out at you. You have to make the decision. So here I had to make a decision. And I saw that the child had a lot of problems in other tests where you had to retrieve things. So guess what? I called GLR a overall strength because I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I just wanted to see what would happen. Remember, the last one I counted it as a deficit, but he also had these deficits here. So let's find out what happened. I still got a yes, yes, yes. Okay, so even though, and again, I chose the retrieval fluency, GR, as the deficit corresponding to basic reading, and I still got a yes, yes, yes. So even, again, one of them I chose GLR as a strength, one of them I chose GLR as a weakness, but just merely by choosing that new area of GR as the weakness, I still could get a yes, yes, yes. So I'm sure there are a billion different scenarios that could happen here, okay? I'm just trying to give you a basic idea of what I did, what happened to me, and what you could do and think about when you're doing these things. But I'm going to move on for time's sake. Processing speed, so new ways to look at this. So this is the ability to control attention to automatically, quickly, and fluently perform relatively simple cognitive tasks. Okay. This was really interesting to me. When people always say, what is processing speed? I always told them, well, it's the speed at which you learn something. And that's not true. Okay, I was wrong. It does not predict the speed at which someone learns something. Rather, it can predict skilled performance once someone has already learned it. So once you've already learned the task, it can predict the speed at which you perform that task. So like math facts, once you've learned your math facts, processing speed does not tell you how fast you're going to learn math facts, but it does tell you how quickly you're going to be able to do math facts once you've already learned it. Clear as mud? Okay. The narrow abilities under here are perceptual speed, which you already knew, and perceptual speed is kind of broken down into search and compare. And then there's other ones here I'm not going to talk about. So looking at perceptual speed as a new intermediate level ability that subsumes multiple factors, and the book actually wrote, is there more to P than P itself, which is kind of weird. But anyway, so they're kind of looking at that right now, but really nothing's changed as far as you guys are concerned, except for maybe what you test. So the recommendation is to test perceptual speed search and perceptual speed compare. So perceptual speed search are tests that have like the word cancellation on them. Perceptual speed compare are ones that are like symbol search, or the WJ-Cog ones like letter pattern matching, where you're actually matching, you're looking at one thing and then trying to match it over on the right. So I just put it on the WISC. I'm not sure what coding is, so I don't know if anybody can help me out with that. R9, which is rate of test taking, is not a thing anymore, so don't test it. So let's look recommendations for GS. So we have the WISC, we have coding, which is perceptual speed, and I am not sure if it's search or compare. And then you have symbol search, which is search. So I put a happy smiley face because I don't know what really coding is. Iffy. The WJ-Cog has letter pattern matching, which is the perceptual speed compare, and pair cancellation, which is perceptual speed search. So yay! Once again, WJ is good. The DOS Speed of information processing, I don't know what it is, so it's thing, and the KBC has nothing. So really your best option here is the WJ-COG, possibly the WISC. Then we get to GC, the queen of process. Remember GF was the king, GC is the queen. For time's sake, I mean, you can read this, but it's basically, there's two things that go along with GC. You got to have language and you got to have knowledge. So language plus knowledge equals GC, right? So when you're testing GC, the recommendation is to test either language development or lexical knowledge, which are the narrows, as well as general information. And if there's time, listening ability would be great, but you don't have to have it. Let's think about it. So recommendations for GC. The WISC has similarities and vocabulary. They're both lexical knowledge tests. They do not have information. Now there is information. There's a test called information on the WISC, and you could put that in XBASS and you could get a composite. So, I mean, there's kind of a smiley face there, but if you just gave those two tests, it does not meet the recommendations. The WJ-COG oral vocabulary, which is that very first test you gave, antonyms and synonyms, and then general information, you know, what do you do with a thing, or where would you usually find a something, is general knowledge. That's a happy face. So it does meet the recommendations. The DOS2 has verbal similarities and word definitions, and they're both lexical knowledge. So again, and the DOS2 does not have an information test, a knowledge test. The KBC has verbal knowledge and riddles, and they're both, again, lexical knowledge. So again, it does not meet the recommendation. So really, the WJ gives you two tests and you meet the recommendations. The WISC, you would have to give a third test called information in order to get your composite. Then we move on to GF. So it's the second class citizen of processes. There are changes coming to this. It's actually one of the more studied process. There's large scale and small scale. So large scale would be like this guy. Large scale visual processing would be like if you would have to be able to read a map. So you'd be able to kind of say, okay, I'm here. How do I get to the Kroger or wherever? Small scale are things like you're doing something in your hand, like a Rubik's Cube or something like that. There's also static versus dynamic. So static things, static spatial abilities tests are like block design. The stimulus does not move. It's just a picture. But the dynamic ones are things where the stimulus is moving. We don't have any tests for this, like catching a ball or whatever. And this is an area that's coming up because it can correlate to video games, graphic designs, and other things like that. So be on the lookout for that. The narrows under GV are visualization and then all this other stuff. And I don't really care. Oh, there is visual memory in there, which we do know. And maybe you've done spatial scanning. So the recommendations for GV, GV is actually one of the more researched areas. However, it remains a difficult area because it really doesn't correlate to general intelligence very much. Okay. The main recommendation is, of course, visualization. All right. But they say that it's important to have one with manipulatives and one with no manipulatives. Okay. So that would be like the WISC has block design and visual puzzles. One has manipulatives, one is just pictures. The narrow abilities under GV have little correlation to each other. So even the narrows don't have correlation to each other, which is why frequently you get non-cohesive scores when you do GV. That's always a hassle. Don't confuse visual memory tests with visual working memory tests. So some visual memory tests can become more like a working memory test. So you have to be careful with that. So let's look at this. So the WISC has block design, visual puzzles. Those are both visualizations, so they don't meet the recommendations. The WJ-COG has visualization and picture recognition, so you get two different narrow abilities there. So that does meet the recommendations. DOS2 has pattern construction and recall of designs. This is two different narrows, and it meets the recommendations. The KBC has rover and triangles or block design depending on your age, And so you have two different narrows there, and I'm saying that it does meet the recommendations. So a lot of them meet the recommendations. The whisk is really the one that doesn't. And then lastly, we have GA. So GA is more important now. So there's a new definition for GA. The ability to discriminate, remember, reason, and work creatively on auditory stimuli, which may consist of tones, environmental sounds, and speech units. They took out the word nonverbal from the old definition because auditory and nonverbal, those didn't really seem to go together. It was confusing too many people. GA has nothing to do with hearing, folks. Just like Beethoven went deaf later on and still wrote, his Ninth Symphony and all that. GA has to do with the brain, has nothing to do with your ears. Okay, and I've heard diagnosticians explain it that way, which is wrong. GA is the Rodney Dangerfield of CHD. I don't get no respect kind of thing. But now it's getting a lot more respect because of the big D word for dyslexia. So GA has been the least studied because of the lack of technology to measure it, okay? But now it's becoming more and more. So it plays an important role in all these areas, um, and there is a growing body of research. The growing body of research under GA with all of these different things has not been put into an overarching theory, which is why we haven't gotten a whole lot more about it, but it's coming. The main narrow is phonetic coding and of course all the others which you don't really test. So again, the main recommendation is phonetic coding. That has not changed. So the WISC has no phonetic coding. The WJ has phonological processing and non-word repetition, both phonetic coding. It meets the recommendations. The WJ oral language has segmentation and sound blending, both phonetic coding. I also usually give sound awareness, but it's not part of the composite, so it meets the recommendations. The DOS2 has one phonetic coding test, so it wouldn't give you a composite if you just gave that, so it doesn't meet the recommendations. The KBC has none. And you're going to have to supplement GA with other things like the CTOP or other tests that you find helpful. So for kicks and giggles, here again, good luck. I've got kind of a whole, this is all of the tests. And as you can see, I just did this. These are the tests that met the recommendations in each area, as you can see, okay, in each area. But no test meets all the criteria. So tests should always be chosen based on referral question, child's needs, and what test will give you the best measurements of what you're trying to measure, okay? So you can't just give one battery and it's going to meet all the recommendations. Maybe sooner or later they might come out, with that. If I had a PhD, maybe I'd start working on that, but I don't, so it's not going to happen. But maybe someday somebody will. So the rest of the chapter is just basically going over all of those other areas that I'm not mentioning. It's kind of interesting, emotional intelligence. I don't know. That's weird. I don't know how you would test that. So the rest of part two, these are some of the chapters I'm skipping. I'm not going to really read these to you, but there's one about the triarchic theory. I didn't even read that. This one is kind of interesting. It has the past theory, and it's saying that the case 2 and the KBC2 are better for kids with ASD, ADHD, and also kids from different cultures and races. So you might want to read more about that. And then we have this one, test intelligence using brain scans. Yikes. Oh my gosh, they put us out of business. And then this other one is for PPIK, if you want to interested. So then part three has all these chapters, right? And it lists all these tests. And basically it's just written by different authors of experts on these tests. Just kind of gives you an overview of the test. I encourage you to look at this chapter, learn more about the tests you like, but also maybe learn more about tests you don't care about or haven't done. I'm surprised how many people have never given the DOS, but it is great. The WISC-5 integrated is pretty good. It's not a test that's going to give you like an IQ. It's a supplement to the WISC-5, the regular one. You may have given the ECAT. So there's some things on here that look pretty good, but I'm going to skip over that. So then part 4 is SLD. So some general things about SLD. We've got an operational definition, which you already know. I wanted to point out on 612 and 613 provides a chart for SLD process, which outlines the 5 levels of SLD. Can you name them? Do you know the 5 levels of SLD? Didn't know there was going to be a quiz. So level 1 is academic achievement, right? So SLD is marked by dysfunction in learning, and learning is somehow disrupted from the normal course by underlying and processing deficits. I like that definition. That's something that parents could probably understand. Level 2 is the exclusionary factors, and of course you all know about exclusionary factors and all of that, so I'm not going to go too much into that. There is, on page 618 to 621, provides an exclusionary factor worksheet that you can use on this level. I'm going to move on. Level 3 is the cognitive ability, so I'm not going to go into that because we've been talking about cognitive abilities for the past almost hour. And then level 4 is the data integration, so your DDC, so that's your pattern of strengths and weaknesses and your triangle, okay, which you kind of are already done that. The only thing I'm going to say about this is domain specific. I don't know, some people have a problem explaining what domain specific is. So domain specific means that you have a deficit in very specific cognitive processes, but not enough to be pervasive, if that makes sense. So if you have too many uh, deficits, they're not domain specific, they're pervasive now. Okay. So one is the top oval, one's the bottom left oval. And then the bottom right oval is the data integration, which is the unexpected underachievement. And the book doesn't really talk about this, mainly because it's a cognitive assessment book, not an achievement assessment book. And then finally, there's level 5, which is the impact on educational performance. So you have to talk about how all of this stuff affects the child's education. Then we get to chapter 3, which is ID. This was interesting. So new things to consider for ID. Individuals with ID will present with a variety of intellectual and adaptive limitations ranging from impairment and like these skills to academic and social difficulties. You already know that. This was interesting though, something that not a lot of people have thought about, but this is basically saying that kids with an intellectual disability often present with behavioral problems. And sometimes we get stuck on the behavior and not what's causing it. And so sometimes the lack of understanding of what's going on around you can cause behavior problems. So the research just proves it that 6.3% of kids with ID exhibit physical aggression, 4.9 self-injurious behavior, and 3.0 destructive behavior. So just because a child has a behavior problem does not say, oh, well, it can't be ID, it's just a behavior problem, it's just ADHD, or it's just, something else. Nope, that's not true. The international prevalence of ID is 1%, and I put that in there because, if you're a diagnostician in Texas, you know about the STAR alt, which the federal government has put a cap of 1% of kids taking the STAR alt, which is kind of weird because they got onto us about the 8.5% cap that TA was doing, but then they went back and put a 1% cap on us. I don't know, whatever. I'm not in charge of the world. Other things to consider: what causes ID? So a lot of people ask me, where does ID come from? And so ID comes from prenatal influences, which is the genetic stuff, malformations of brain, in utero exposure to toxins, teratogens like metals, chemicals, radiation, and even heat, like if you're in a hot tub, like if you take too hot of a bath, drugs or alcohol, exposure to uh, maternal or placental infections. The perinatal influences are things that occur right before, during, or after birth, like traumas. And then the postnatal influences are things that occur after childbirth, like infection, neurocognitive disorders, head injuries, congenital or degenerative conditions, or exposure to toxins, and sustained social deprivation. So things to consider. So page 645 has a chart that compares all the different definitions from all the different agencies, which is just kind of interesting to look at. The most salient factors for discriminating between autism spectrum disorder and ID are language development and social skills. Now I want to talk about ASD real quick. The autism piece is the autism piece. I mean, you've got social skill problems, you've got the motor movements, the stemming, and all that. But a lot of people don't realize the spectrum part comes from cognitive abilities. So higher functioning kids with autism have higher cognitive ability, right? That's the spectrum part. Lower kids with more profound autism spectrum have lower cognitive abilities. So, sometimes you get an advocate or a parent like, why are we testing cognitive abilities on a child that has autism? Well, we're trying to find where they are on that spectrum so we can make some decisions about school. Children with ID can either have autism by themselves or ID or both. You can have autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. They are not mutually exclusive. About 4% of kids with ID also have a communication disorder. Now, in my district, every kid with autism spectrum disorder also has a speech impairment, and that's true for a lot of districts. But the research is saying 4%. And so the new research suggests that the full-scale IQ scores are more reliable at the lower end than at the higher end. So actually, if you're testing for gifted kids, they have an IQ of 130 or whatever, that's less reliable of a score than the kids you're testing who have a 70 or a 60 IQ. So that's what the research says. So if parents are complaining, hey, I don't think that's the right, how reliable is that score, you can say the research shows that uh, scores on the lower end, the tests are better apt at looking at the lower end than the higher end. Um, the chapter discusses the importance of using multiple sources of data and ruling out other possibilities. So again, there's no exclusionary factor involved in ID, but there should be. Okay, so you need to be looking at that. They talked about that at length. Students with a full scale of 75 should never be considered for ID. Not all broad composites have to be in the ID range. So, when you test for ID, you might test your 7 different areas or whatever. 37% of kids have at least one composite score in the average range. Oftentimes, this might be visual processing or one of the easier things like processing speed, and they'll actually have like a 90 something in one of those composites. 77% have at least one composite in the low average range, so in the 80s. A lot of them might have, GLR might be a little higher, something like that. Um, so just because all of the composites are not below 70 doesn't mean that they don't have ID. And a lot of people get hung up on that. And they also say that, well, you have non-cohesive scores, so your full scale is not reliable because the scores are so different. Actually, the research shows the opposite. They are very reliable, even though there is some variance. And then the full scale IQ, if you're one of those diags who test for PPCD, you're trying to get a full scale on an infant or a preschooler, 2, 3, 4-year-old, they are not reliable over time. Okay, so please, 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 in my opinion, please do not put ID on a child, um, and they're just not reliable scores, and the research is proving that, and we've heard that from advocates before, and it's true. They're not lying. They're right. Now it doesn't mean it doesn't give you a general sense of their cognitive functioning, but it's not a reliable score. So if you're like 69, 70, 71, like you really can put ID on that child? I don't think so. In Texas, we have non-categorical early childhood for autism, ID, and other things. So that might be a better option. All right, so then we get to culturally and linguistic diverse learners. So here's where we get to the CLIM. Okay, but a couple things to think about. When you get a score on a test, you are comparing the child to the norm group that took the test. So if you're testing a kid who doesn't fit the norm, you cannot interpret, or doesn't fit that norm group, then you really can't interpret those scores as reliable. A lot of people do, you know. You have to look at the norm group of the test that you're giving. This happens a lot. I do this. Using translators to help you test does not make the test results more valid. You know, if a test and somebody's sitting right next to you and they're translating into Spanish or Vietnamese or whatever, that does not. In fact, it's really just, you should not be doing that. Does not make the test results valid. There are occasions where you got to do it because there are no cognitive tests in Vietnamese, but of course more nonverbal stuff might be appropriate. But even reliant on nonverbal tests do not give you the whole picture. It doesn't give you a GC, and it still can be culturally biased. So the pictures in those nonverbal tests can be culturally biased because they're normal kids in America, not not Cambodia. Um, they also do not yield any less biased results when testing to get a full scale. So really the best thing to do is try to test in the child's native language, but of course you have to have a test in that native language. You got to have a tester in the native language. Um, the chapter gives a very detailed explanation of other issues for testing children from various backgrounds. So that's a good chapter. Now, this is the CLEM. If you look on the CLEM, this is not from the book, okay? Not from the book, okay? This is from the CLEM on the XBASS. If you go to the XBASS, there is a blue button, and it's labeled, I believe, test variability or something like that. It has a question mark. It's like a blue button on the top left, and when you click on that, you get this. You get this. And it says, because each cell in the matrix is based on an aggregate value for the scores entered, if there is a substantial variability between or among the scores, the resulting aggregate cell value may appear to be within the expected range, particularly when viewed in the graph. Therefore, it is important to identify cells where higher values are being combined with lower values, as they may give the impression of expected performance that may be masking the significance and validity of a low score. Wow. Let me show you what I mean. Here you have one of the graphs on the CLEM. I entered some scores. Look at this graph. So if you've never used the CLEM before, if those blue bars fall within this shaded area or above, then you would say, well, the child's issue is a language issue. Okay, they really can't move forward with an LD diagnosis with that because my test scores are really not very valid because, you know, it's more of a second language issue. So some people would stop at that graph and say, look, the child GNQs, and not think anything more about it. But if you if you go back and you read what I just read to you, it may change your mind. So look at this. So if you pretend you give the WISC 5 on a child, matrix reasoning 82, visual puzzles 100. That gives you a 91 average. Okay. If you think about what the graph I just showed you, that 91 average made it look like that this child's abilities are typical for a child with a second language learner, as a second language learner. Okay, but if you look at the other GF tests, figure weights was a 100, 82, 82, and a 100. They're not cohesive. So I gave like concept formation. Look what concept formation was. It was an 80. So now I have an 82 and an 80 and a 100. So then I gave analysis synthesis, 75. So I have an 82, a 75, an 80, and this weird 100 over here. Maybe he was just really good at that. Is that really a deficit, or is it expected for a second language learner? But what this is saying is when you have high scores in an area and low scores in a cell, it can mask it. It can make it look like that is an expected level for that child, but it's really not. Look what happens when I take away the 100. I get that. So if just taking away the 100 Now I can see that that GF score, that 82, which is the only thing left in that cell, that is not expected. This child may have a learning disability. So I would have missed that had I not really thought about that. And, I don't think many people click on that tab. I don't think many people think about that. So it's something to really consider when you're testing these kids, is to really look at the data that you're entering. Because again, the CLIM and the XBASS, it's all just a dumb calculator. You are the one making decisions. All right, moving on. So a chapter I missed was 24. It's talking about physical disabilities, traumatic brain injury. We do test kids with that, but I'm just not going to go into it, but definitely something you might want to read. So then the last, or part 5, is linking assessment data to intervention. So I'm skipping some of these chapters here, just because there's just not much new there. I mean, it talks about the XBASS and different things, the sample reports and stuff like that. So I'm skipping that. Chapter 28, I only really have one slide on that. This is a great chapter, folks. I would buy this book just for this chapter, 782 to 798. So the book takes you through each broad processing error and explains how it affects academic performance. It also provides some suggestions for interventions. And this stuff is very important to know, and it iterates new information and ways of thinking. I would highly recommend reading this chapter. There's just way too much. It could really be its own separate uh, presentation. There's just too much. I mean, this presentation would go on for 4 hours if I did that. So moving on to part 6. So now we're talking about emerging things, new things that are coming. So this is one, chapter 32, functional CHC. So not just CHC, but functional CHC. And it was written by some pretty prominent names here. Okay, Richard Woodcock and all that. So basically, the chapter is pretty short, but it gives you a side by side of the functional CHC and the traditional CHC groups. And what it does is it puts all of the broad and narrows into 3 groups: acquired knowledge, thinking abilities, and cognitive efficiency. And it just kind of changes the way you look at certain things and how you're testing and how you're thinking about that kid. It was really confusing to me at first, but once you sit and think about it, I don't know if this is something that's going to affect us soon. I don't foresee it, but it may be coming into play at some point. And then the last big thing I want to talk about is orthographic processing or mapping. This is chapter 35. This is a book that I wrote. I actually made a PowerPoint presentation on this. It's something I could upload to YouTube if I get enough feedback. It's called Equipped for Reading Success. It was written by Kilpatrick, who wrote the chapter in the book, in this book that I'm talking about, David Kilpatrick. Oh my God, he is so knowledgeable about this stuff, and he's also very wordy. So what he could say in 2 sentences, he takes like 2 pages. But anyway, Equipped for Reading Success is a fabulous book. It really explains orthographic mapping far better than I could ever do. But this chapter discusses orthographic processing. This is kind of a new area of testing, although it's not really new. It's been around for a while. It's just new to us. We're just hearing about it, some of us. If you don't understand it, then you could be missing a very important area of testing. Please read this chapter. Again, David Kilpatrick, he wrote this book too. I would encourage you to get it. So I'm just wondering, have you ever tested a kid like this? So if you put a word in front of the child, they can generally decode it. But if you put a book in front of them, they can't read it. They're slow readers. They guess at the words. They read the same word 3 different ways on different pages. They spell phonetically and have a harder time with sight words or irregular words. I know you've tested kids like this. These are kids with orthographic mapping or orthographic processing problems. So um, the chapter discusses the importance of sight word vocabulary, also known as orthographic lexicon, and how it affects reading fluency. It discusses the D word, dyslexia, at length and how orthographic processing is involved with that. This is a huge deal right now that we're going through. It talks about how visual memory has nothing to do with reading. So you know how some of these batteries, they test visual memory like picture recognition or something. It really has nothing to do with reading, so I don't even know why we test it, but anyway. It discusses at length what orthographic processing is and how it works. It has been very helpful to me as a diagnostician to know this, because if you want to really diagnose something, you need to know how it works and how it can go wrong. So like if I take my car, if something's going wrong with my car, I don't take it to a hairstylist. I take it to a mechanic, because the mechanic knows how the car works and they can diagnose what's going on and then they can fix it. So if you don't know about orthographic processing, how it works, how it affects reading, how it affects writing, you can't diagnose it. And we could be missing a lot of these kids, okay? It talks about the developmental levels of phonological processing word reading. So there's stages that a child goes through in learning how to read, and most kids go through those stages naturally, okay? Um, but some kids don't. So it talks about how the idea of distinct subtypes of dyslexia like dysphonetic, surface, etc. are not supported by empirical data. I had read about this. I think Equip for Success talks about these different types, but really there's not a lot of empirical data for that. What they're saying is there's three types of reading disorders. There's dyslexia, hyperlexia, and the combined. So dyslexia refers to poor word reading. It's just kind of an overall, you're bad at reading. You're bad at reading words. Hyperlexia is that you are bad at comprehending what you read. And then the combined is the combination of poor word reading and poor comprehension. The chapter also discusses rapid automatic naming and working memory and how they're kind of all coming into play with dyslexia. Again, I'm not doing this justice, folks. You need to read this chapter. In order to show that you've learned the word, you should be able to read it within 3 seconds. So you know how like on the KTEA or something they give you, or the WJ, those first tests where you read, the child reads a list of words. You just show them a list and they have to read the words. If they're not reading them within 3 seconds, then they really haven't learned the word. There's a difference between identifying a word and learning a word. So in schools, we teach kids all kinds of strategies on how to identify a word. So they can decode it when they don't know it. We spend a lot of time on that. Phonics, uh, language learning intervention, LLI, other programs, and they talk about how to decode words. Really, we never go to the next step, which is teaching them how to learn a word. And that's where orthographic processing comes in. When you have learned a word, you should be able to recall it within 3 seconds. And so you've tested those kids in these tests where they can read all those words, but it takes them 20 minutes. And yes, their score is average, but are they really good readers? No. So it kind of gives you a false sense of higher ability than is really there. So that's why it's important to know about orthographic mapping and processing. So these are just some of the chapters that I skipped. A lot of these are more for like psychologists, but there's executive functioning there. There's the DSM-5 there. Um, the 3-tiered system and all that. You're welcome to look at those. I really didn't read a whole lot about some of these things, just because, there were other chapters that were more interesting. All right, so we've come to the end of this. Again, I'm going to reiterate this one more time. This is a 1,100 page book, folks. This was an hour and 14 minute presentation. There is no way that I covered everything. So please, 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 just like you're taught to read the manual of the test kit, okay? Don't rely on somebody teaching you the test. You got to read the manual. I'm telling you, read this book. There's a lot more in it than what I'm saying and a lot more to learn. They put it in probably better ways than I did here, and there's just a lot more information. It's kind of like the difference between reading the book and seeing the movie. Okay, so what I'm doing is the movie, but there's always a lot more information in the book. So again, I want to thank you for giving me the time. There is my email address down here, trey.stogsdill@cfisd.net. That's my work email. Please, if you want to shoot me an email, hey, I liked your stuff, give me more. Here's a topic, can you look at it and do a presentation? Or hey, you said you had a presentation on dyslexia or orthographic processing or whatever. Can you put that up? Give me some feedback. I like doing this stuff. You know, don't mind it. Uh, Please, I'm fragile emotionally, so please don't give me stuff like you're the worst presenter I've ever uh, had the displeasure of watching or something like that. If you don't like my presentation, just don't give me any feedback. But I do like the positive feedback or other you know suggestions and things like that. So there is my email address, and that's all, folks.